Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Webinar, a joint sponsored webinar between AASHTO and ASDWA on how state highway and drinking water programs can work together for mutual benefits and reduce impacts from road salt. We're very excited to be able to partner with ASDWA on this webinar. It's an important topic, we know, because we had about 110 people register for the webinar from a variety of places, including state DOTs, state drinking water programs, some water utilities, as well as EPA. So we're very pleased for this opportunity, and we'll go ahead and get started. Next slide. So before we get started, I'd like to just provide a very high-level overview of AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, and let you know a little bit about our Center for Environmental Excellence. So AASHTO is the membership organization for all 52 highway and transportation departments. That's all 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico. We represent all modes of transportation and work to provide an opportunity for our members to share information about operation and maintenance of an integrated transportation system. And we also play a critical role in educating the public and members of Congress as well about the role transportation can play in quality of life and economic development. The Center for Environmental Excellence at AASHTO is a partnership with Federal Highway Administration. It started in 2001. The main goal of this center is to provide information to our practitioners at the DOTs and other key stakeholders and other state agencies about environmental stewardship and accelerating streamlining in the transportation project delivery process. The center provides technical assistance, training opportunities, a platform to exchange information among peers, partnership building opportunities through peer exchanges, and other environmental tools. Next slide. So the purpose of our webinar today is to provide information to state drinking water programs and state highway programs on how they can work together for mutual benefits. And also to share examples and some specific information on best practices for road salt applications and impacts to drinking water. Next slide. So just quickly to run through the agenda for today's webinar, as we're providing this welcome to you all, an introduction to AASHTO. I will turn it over to my colleague, Deirdre Mason from ASDWA, to provide this similar view into her organization. We're excited today to hear from Pierce Rigrod on the New Hampshire experience, and Caleb Dobbins as well from New Hampshire. And Lee Curry will provide information on Maryland's experience, and we'll also hear from Russ Urich from Maryland as well. And as I mentioned earlier, from New Hampshire, we have Pierce, who's a supervisor, Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau for New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, and Caleb is an engineer with the State Highway Maintenance Department at the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. From Maryland, we have Lee, who is the Director for Water and Science Administration at the Maryland Department of Environment, and Russ is the Director of the Office of Maintenance for the State Highway Administration within the Maryland Department of Transportation. Next. And now I'll turn it over to Deirdre.
Thank you very much, Melissa. So just a little bit about ASDWA. Our mission is to protect public health and the economy through the provision of safe drinking water. Our members are the drinking water program administrators from the 50 states, territories, the Navajo Nation, and BC, and they provide public water system oversight by regulating them and also providing technical assistance and funding, for example, through the Drinking Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF set-asides. And they also coordinate with multiple partners to prioritize and support drinking water protection. So we wanted to share with you some information about the handout and webpage that ASDWA developed on the intersection of roads and drinking water. And you can see the web link here. So I'm going to share some of the content from the handout and the web page in the next 2 slides that go along with the title of our webinar on how to coordinate between the 2 programs for mutual benefits and reduce impacts from road salt. So the first opportunity here in the table, which you'll find in our handout and our web page as well, is to share GIS map overlays and source water protection areas. The map on the bottom right shows an example of a delineated wellhead protection area, and the well locations are indicated by the red dots in the middle of the green circle. This area and the pink circle around it show the setback zone for the wellhead, which is the most susceptible or most vulnerable area to drinking water contamination. The outer boundary, shown in the yellowish color, portrays the recharge area for the wells based on time of travel, and also are susceptible to drinking water contamination. So the gray roads on the map and the blue lines in the middle and bottom right, if you can see them, show the path of stormwater through this area as well. And if this was a surface water map showing the source water protection area, you would see the upstream streams or river in the watershed area based on specified times of travel to the drinking water intake. So using these maps and coordinating between programs can help include considerations for planning and development using land use protections and tailored approaches for road construction, design, and stormwater runoff to prevent drinking water contamination. And it's helpful to apply best practices and remediation and mitigation actions in these areas to keep road salt and other contaminants from reaching the drinking water source. It's also helpful to conduct emergency response planning and exercises and to have early warning or notification systems in place for ensuring timely response by water systems, highway programs, and emergency responders to contain a spill and conduct necessary steps to prevent contaminated water from entering a drinking water treatment plant or remove it if it does enter. This table is also in our handout and webpage and looks at road salt impacts using the multi-barrier approach to ensure safe drinking water. The multi-barrier approach includes source water protection, drinking water treatment, distribution system delivery, and community involvement. And I'm not going to go into details on these since this is what you'll hear from our presenters today in New Hampshire and Maryland, but please do check out our webpage that also includes additional resources. And before we move on to our presenters, I want to ask our audience to please type your questions into the box on your webinar control panel. We will not be taking verbal questions, so you may type your questions in at any time during the webinar, and we'll answer all the questions after all the presenters are finished speaking. And just a reminder that after the webinar, we will post a video recording on our website for viewing later if you would like to do that. And we will go ahead and get started with our first speaker, who is Pierce Regrod from the state of New Hampshire. So Pierce.
Okay, hi Deirdre, and hi everyone. I believe everybody can hear me well, so I'm just going to get started. Great day to talk about salt and road maintenance practices, at least in the Northeast. And in New Hampshire, we just received a foot of snow, so it's been, I'm sure, quite a struggle today for those of you in the Northeast to move along the roads. And today, my title of my presentation is New Hampshire's Experience and Approaches to Reducing Salt Impacts Upon Drinking Water Resources. And I'm going to briefly move through our experiences and focus on some of the sort of defined things we do under a protocol and recommendations that New Hampshire and DES have agreed to long ago, and that we integrate as part of our sort of operations, or the way that we work together and collaborate. That touches on those things that Deirdre just mentioned in the fact sheet. So I don't have a tremendous amount of time this morning, so I'm going to breeze through things, and people can, as Deirdre mentioned, pose questions later, and this will be posted later online. So what I'm going to start off is just to sort of frame this out a little bit. As you know, Those of us in the environmental and drinking water arena and the transportation arenas face this constant balance of how are we going to both protect public health. I'm sorry, next slide. Public health versus public safety. We certainly want people to get where they need to go safely on a regular basis, and that's the priority for days like today, that we need to minimize that risk so that we're not ending up with people running off the roads and many negatives that go along with the safety issue. And really the question is, how are we optimizing our road maintenance, particularly in areas where there are sources of drinking water that are nearby that are either already experiencing some elevated numbers? And what are those practices? What are the storm practices that are available to our state and local transportation and winter maintenance staff? Next slide, please. So as Deirdre mentioned, there's a number of these intersections that take place that our Bureau and the New Hampshire Department of Transportation are already kind of engaged in. We switch, we swap and trade map overlays electronically during project reviews. We are involved in, to some extent, with the road design construction processes, and with our local and municipal bodies that handle land use regulations that have to do with applying lower salt or no salt zones in particular areas near drinking water. That's on a voluntary basis. Best practices and spill control planning and exercises, all things that are done, I would say at this point in New Hampshire, kind of on an, again, on an as needed or on a voluntary basis. But those are all things that we do touch upon as an approach to achieve the objective of optimizing our salt use and our protection activities near sources of drinking water. Next slide, please. Again, just to take a minute, we all of chloride and sodium, from vegetation impacts to corrosion of both appliances and infrastructure, surface water impacts, and of course in New Hampshire we use about 60% of our population uses groundwater, and certainly that's in areas where there's a lot of road networks that can be even more of an issue in terms of trying to manage both salt applications over winter and continuing to keep chloride levels low. Next slide, please. So it's, as I mentioned, it's a health issue and it's a cost issue. As you know, for drinking water, we have some standards that, health advisories that are recommended by EPA, including 20 milligrams per liter for people who are at high risk or on low salt sodium diets. There are issues with taste and having to implement treatment for reverse osmosis and other things that are expensive to do that. And chloride is mobile. Once it's in the water, it can go and move around. And as I mentioned also, it's corrosive. Next slide, please. What we do know, and what we think we know at least, is that as you get closer to a well, a source, you tend to see higher impacts, or I should say occurrences of, and concentrations rather, of chloride. So this graph is, the thing to take from this graph is as that curve kind of moves to the right and the distance from the source diminishes from 75 feet to 5 feet, you're seeing much higher chloride concentrations in terms of the overall total percentage occurrence of those values. So basically, the blue line to the right is showing you much higher numbers as you reduce that distance to the source from 75 feet to 5 feet. So proximity matters. Next slide, please. And we really know I think we can pretty much assure ourselves that the salt is generally coming from roads, but if you look at this graph, the takeaway or the pie chart is that how big a role it appears private parking lots are playing in salt that's making its way into the groundwater. with relative background levels in New Hampshire of sodium and chloride below 30 milligrams per liter. I think what we've really got work to do is in the private sector and in commercial property where parking lots are predominant and are being there's a lot of application going on. And I think in the I-93 studies, that's backed up by the work that DOT and programs at DES worked on to demonstrate that parking lots are playing a pretty significant role in the contribution of salt into groundwater. Next slide, please. We've also taken a look at our public water supply database, our compliance database that for IOCs for sodium and chloride that are collected every 3 years. And looking at these two maps, what you're seeing are sodium and chloride levels in public water system wells from 95 and to 2005. And I know you can't read this too well, perhaps. Basically, the darker colors in red and in green on the right, in each of the two images to the right, that's 2005, and it's representing a higher median value for both sodium and chloride. So what we're seeing over time, and the study that we commissioned USGS to do in New Hampshire was to look at the overall trends by sort of mining both public water supply data actually and private well data that we got that was available to us from the Department of Public Health. And so again, the takeaway on this slide is, we're seeing through this time period a rise in both sodium and chloride, and in certain places, especially if you look in the eastern southeastern portion of the state, you can see the darker colors where most of the people live in New Hampshire, where we have more development. We're seeing higher changes or greater changes in that portion of the state. Next slide, please. So along with proximity to a source, which seems to imply higher numbers, is the production volume of the well itself. So bigger wells tend to need greater area, both surface and groundwater, to draw that water. And so you're going to be seeing in bigger wells a bigger sort of catchment area for that source. And so that's I'm leading up to the recommendations that DES and DOT are subscribing to. And the two factors have to do with the production volume of the well and the proximity of the well to paved areas or to road projects, essentially. Next slide, please. So way back in 1995, the Bureau responded to a request from DOT to kind of put together some ideas and some guidance on what we should be doing when DOT is working on road projects near a source. And so the Bureau published this document, and it is essentially a series of tiered protections or levels, which how they're referred to in this document, that are applied to DOT projects. And they're not altogether that complicated, but they're simply a roadmap, so to speak, for how project reviews from DES or recommendations from us during projects would take place. And it's essentially a tool we use to screen projects as they come through DOT. And DOT has a fairly regular series of meetings and review processes that take place over a fairly extended period of time. So our recommendations, which include this and other things, go to them and to the project managers at DOT, who then take a look at them. Next slide, please. So I'm just gonna skip through here how these levels break out and try to give you just a thumbnail about each one, given the time I have. So really, you're telescoping. If you're reading left to right, the levels are level 1 through 4, and they're broad, and then they narrow down. The first is basically we'd like certain practices to be in play statewide, and then going to level 2, looking at wellhead protection areas, and then special areas that have been designated as important groundwater areas, and then level 3 down to specific discrete distances within which those distances we'd like certain recommendations for stormwater to be followed, and then down to sanitary protective radii, essentially those distances that are the public health setbacks for sources. Next slide, please. So part of these recommendations, one of the initial statements is really just about feasibility. So DOT does a lot of work. They're the largest landowner in the state, and they've got a lot of things to do. And so this first level is basically, we know that many of the practices that they employ and others employ are already removing things that we don't want to get into groundwater. So for instance, this particular protection level is pretty basic. We're basically saying, use those appropriate stormwater treatment BMPs that you are using that we know work for a variety of contaminants. And of course, this is anywhere in New Hampshire, so we're looking at a very broad area. Next slide, please. So slightly telescoping down a bit, this slide, the next level 2 applies to areas that are within wellhead protection areas. In New Hampshire, many of our smaller wellhead protection areas are not particularly big areas. They're basically round circles that represent the estimated area that is contributing water to those wells. But larger community systems have pretty extensive wellhead protection areas that can cover a lot of ground. And what we've added to these, what we basically are recommending to DOT is to look at those most appropriate stormwater practices, which include the things that they already do, and then what we've kind of grouped under something called non-structural measures. So these are things like low salt, no salt policies that can be implemented, or perhaps technologies that can be put on board, but onboard trucks. But generally speaking, they're not structural. So the idea here is to we're now looking at these areas that we know are contributing water to wellhead protection areas, but they may not be influenced at all by the practices that are going on because of the distances that are involved away from the sources. Next slide, please. So this is a map I kind of copied out of a GIS MXD, or a file that we used during the project reviews. And so this shows 2 wellhead protection areas in a red line where a specific project is taking place, buffered at 1,000 feet. And so we screen to see if those sources are within these distances as sort of a first step to kind of figure out, okay, where's the project? We receive that information from DOT. We overlay the wellhead protection areas and the sources. They're color-coded, and it doesn't show it here, but we also know whether those sources have elevated sodium or chloride values that are coded in and change color if there's, say, a higher value or a value that is significantly above the background levels. So as a functional, sort of a mechanical process, we do this kind of basic review as part of that to determine the level and what recommendations we would be looking at, and then use some other ancillary data that goes into this sort of cursory review. Next slide, please. The next slide really gets to when you're starting to get closer to a source. So it sets several discrete distances within which we're asking within 1,000 feet of a large, what we define as a large groundwater source for a public source of drinking water, for a community or non-community, non-transitory system. So we're asking and have in the background, in the back of the document, some specific BMPs from swales to liners, and then diversion practices and curbing and raised railings, and again these other non-structural sort of practices that we're looking for those types of things to be integrated into the final plans that go into a construction or reconstruction or redesign of a DOT project. So again, we're looking at only within those areas within 500 to 1,000 feet from the well. Here's a picture of one particular project where this is in Plymouth, and you can see the wellhead protection area overlaps I-93. This particular source, these sources have both sodium and chloride levels that are well above background. And next slide, please. And so DOT has implemented these smart ditch products, which are essentially draining and all the stormwater coming off the main highway and moving it out of the wellhead protection area. Next slide, please. And so getting down to, you're now within this sort of close proximity to these large community or non-community systems. We're looking for closed drainage systems, again, raised railings, and then non-structural practices. So this doesn't sound all that different, except that the practices are closed. There's not, I don't think from a structural standpoint, we didn't have many other places to go. I mean, we're basically looking for DOT when feasible to be putting in some fairly significant project practices that are not, they're not inexpensive. And so the sort of underlying objective is that we're making recommendations that they actually have a chance of doing without putting them in a huge financial hole where they don't have funding to actually implement. But in these cases where we don't have a lot of these projects, most of the newer sources that have been approved by DES have these setbacks already built into them. So these are, when these things do come up, they're typically when you have a new road project or you have an expansion of a project. It's usually, when these things come up, it's because it's an older well that predates the well siting rules at DES. Next slide, please. So our source water protection program also has, you know, things that are advancing low impact design. Basically, the idea is the, you know, less pavement, less impervious surface you have. I'm sorry, less pavement or less parking, and the design of those sites to reduce the amount of parking or related paved areas, I should say, where you're going to be seeing a lot of salt use is where we want to move at the community level, and see that as a you know, essentially as less area that we have to salt, as a sort of a strategy for minimizing future salt loading. Next slide, please. And so DOT has gotten into the act as well, and in this particular project in Concord, has installed some bioretention practices and reduced the pavement area that's draining water from this particular site. So it's good to see the department taking that on and implementing it to both reduce the contaminants coming off the site and also reducing the need for salt. Next slide, please. So I'm only giving you today kind of a really narrow window of what we're up to because of the time involved, but we work in a variety of areas with both DOT and others to look at road and parking areas and how we can implement low or no salt policies, both the state and local level. Certain communities like Merrimack and others have adopted these policies, particularly around their system, their water system, and their WAPA, their wellhead protection area. And as I mentioned earlier, the design rules that are in place now have already built in protections that for both public water systems and private wells. And we've been working with our permitting programs at DES for large projects to move stormwater discharge areas and practices further away from private wells and public water systems. And we have a number of pilots that involve technology and the use of onboard systems to better calibrate and track salt use as plows are moving around to minimize overlap and salt use. And just getting close to the end here, and DOT has many things that I'm not going to be able to get into, but we certainly are aware of them and supported them in particular areas, particularly around I-93. It's a very, sorry, next slide, very, very big project, one of the biggest projects in the state, and has a lot of attention from a lot of stakeholders, and DOT has been responding and really, I think, piloting a lot of things on the I-93 corridor over the last, I don't know, Caleb will tell you more, 5 to 10 years. So there's a lot more on the table right now for New Hampshire to use and to implement in order to achieve a balance, again, with both salt use and long-term quality of groundwater in New Hampshire. Given the time, next slide, please. I did put in the slide, but I think we're going to hold questions for now. That's what I have to sort of open it up and lay out some of the issues. But if people have questions about the MOU specifically, I should say the recommendations that I've been focusing on in this presentation, I do have a PDF file I can share with the group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierce. And as you said, we are holding questions till the end of the webinar, but please go ahead and type your questions in now or as you think of them when the presenters are talking. So for our next presenter, we're going to go ahead and move forward to Caleb Dobbins, also from New Hampshire's Department of Transportation. So Caleb.
Great, thank you. Yeah, my name is Caleb Dobbins. I'm the State Maintenance Engineer for the New Hampshire Department of Transportation. Pierce did an excellent job in kind of setting up what I'm going to be talking about. First thing I have here on my list, though, is to talk just kind of quickly about balance. He talked about balance, and I did like that shot of the car on its nose early in the presentation. But you know, at least here in New Hampshire DOT, we kind of look at it as a three-legged stool. You know, we have the safety that Pierce hit on. We have the environmental stewardship that we need to take into account, and we also have cost. You know, everybody has a limited budget. So looking at all three of those things, I think that our department does a good job at trying to balance all of those such that no single one entity takes over. Next. So quickly, Pierce had discussed a little bit about some of the design features that New Hampshire DOT puts into our different projects. You know, two of the first ones are obviously either a closed drainage system or a pervious lined swale. If we can take any of this water that has chlorides in it and basically shepherd it away from any of these sensitive areas, the wellhead protection areas, into say a higher volume flow or river or something along the lines that's going to better bring that water to a different location than the wellhead. That's what we try and work towards. Obviously, there's cost that comes along with that. One of the things that people don't think about a lot is actually the condition of the pavement. If my maintenance forces have a smooth pavement in order to plow and treat, then they're going to use less chlorides. They're not having to, for lack of a better term, burn the snow and the ice off. They can mechanically remove that snow and therefore only apply chlorides such that it keeps it from the snow and the ice from adhering to the road so that it can be plowed off. The goal in New Hampshire is not to remove snow with chlorides, it is to remove snow with mechanical means and only use chlorides in order to further that ability to do that. One of the things that the folks seem to kind of miss an awful lot is sunlight. I like to say is, you know, Mother Nature bringeth and Mother Nature can taketh away. So if you can just get sunlight onto a road, and I'll show a slide later on, what that'll do is it aids our forces in not having to apply that same amount of chlorides, as well as even the storm we just had is a perfect example of that. Is that we can get the light in there and heat that pavement up even before the storm, and then we can get out ahead of the storm before the water and the snow starts to refreeze and be able to stay ahead of it. Separate from chlorides, New Hampshire DOT also has instituted on a number of our projects, just in general for you drinking water folks, basically spill containment structures. Because on the safety thing, things still happen on the roadway. Tankers still have accidents, cars still have fuel tanks that open up. So in some of these areas that we have very sensitive well areas or surface water reservoirs, we've instituted on our projects a very elaborate spill containment program with structures, plans of exactly what gets shut off and when and where, depending on where on the road an accident occurs. Next. So I'm going to speak more towards what I do, which is the maintenance aspect to it. So there's a lot of ways to be able to reduce chlorides. Some of them are equipment related. This one that you're showing right now is a pre-wet system that we use on our trucks. Okay, and although there is an initial cost that comes along with outfitting the system and putting the storage in the sheds, some portion of that we find can be actually offset by the material savings. Here in New Hampshire, we spend between $10 to $12 million a year on the purchase of salt. So if we can have a reduction, next slide, please. If we can have a reduction as shown in this slide, which is the effect of pre-wetting your salt, which is wetting your salt at the spinner, what that does is it reduces the bounce and scatter so that the salt goes where you want it to go. It goes on the section of the roadway that the cars are traveling on, and it doesn't go out into the shoulder. So Michigan did a study a number of years ago, and it shows about a 25 to 30% reduction in the amount of salt that goes where it doesn't need to go. So what that does is it allows you to be able to reduce the amount of salt that you're using, so long as you're putting it exactly where you want it to be. In New Hampshire, our practice is not to salt our shoulders. Again, we let Mother Nature take care of that the day or two afterwards, because we don't have the public traveling on the shoulders typically, so we're not having that material adhering to the road, so we don't need to put the salt on the road to keep the snow from adhering to it because the traffic's not there. Next. So in addition to that, we also employ some brine trucks, which we go out actually prior to a storm and apply liquid brine to the roadway so that at the start of the storm, there is already a layer of salt basically there waiting for the storm to keep that material from adhering. Because once snow or ice adheres to the roadway, and you have to melt it from the top down, the amount of salt that you use goes up astronomically compared to if you can work from the bottom up. So what this does is it uses about an application of about half of what we would normally use on a salt run. We put it down before the storm, and that aids our crews in being able to fight the storm right from the beginning. This truck that's shown on this slide also has what's called an underbelly plow or underbody plow. That allows for an extreme down pressure. So if for some reason it doesn't work out with everything we do before the storm, this truck has the ability, due to the down pressure, to really be able to scrape a lot of that ice off if it does happen to form, and avoid having to go and again treat great thicknesses of ice by using chlorides. Next. And kind of down from the spreader down to the ground, we've also implemented flex. About nothing better than a smooth road to be able to plow. But in New Hampshire, believe it or not, we don't have a lot of smooth roads. So a number of years ago, we started using one manufacturer. There are multiple manufacturers now of these because people have seen the need and the advantage of using these. But it's a flexible plow blade. You know, it's not like your wiper blade or anything, but it allows enough movement of the carbide inserts that are in the carbide blade so that it has some ability to conform actually to the road. And again, that just goes back to the more snow that you can remove from a roadway, the less chlorides or salt are you going to have to apply either during the storm, after the storm. So these have actually been able to reduce our salt usage just simply by the fact that we're removing more snow. And as I said, there's a number of manufacturers. 10 years ago, there was really one manufacturer, and now I would hazard that there's probably at least half a dozen, if not more, that have different designs that do exactly the same thing. Next. So back in the old days, and just for those of you that didn't know this, New Hampshire was the first state in the country to actually directly apply salt to the roadway. Probably not something I should tell this group, but so we've been doing it for a number of years, and we didn't always use best management practices. As this slide shows, you know, that the pile on the top right, it's a salt sand mix. So this was actually prior to straight salt. But you may not be able to read it, but it was mixed in December, but it's been sitting there and it's now March. So that uncovered pile's been sitting out there for about 4 months. So we don't do that anymore. Next. This is what we do now. These are our salt sheds that we're building here in New Hampshire. What our goal is and certainly the MS4 and some of these other things that are coming down the line are certainly pushing us this way. But our goal in New Hampshire is to put an entire season's worth of salt at each of our sheds under cover prior to the start of the winter. What this does, and again, I'm going to keep kind of going back to that three-legged stool, it allows us to have that material to always be able to safely treat the roads. It allows us to buy the material during times where the cost is lower, during the summer when there's more availability and there's less demand. And it also allows us to reduce the impact on the environment because it's completely covered, and we can store it months in advance and have no environmental impact relative to it. What this also shows, and this one happens to be taken in the summer, but as we begin to use the salt that's within those barns, we actually gain the ability to actually do our loading undercover during a storm. So that just aids again in terms of any salt that happens to get spilled at the yard. When it does, it's being spilled in an area that's already undercover. Next. We implement also what we call road weather information systems. Basically, these are weather stations located along the roadway. It tells us things like pavement temperature, air temperature, wind speed, a number of different things. That also, the new ones also have a factor of grip, which tells you the grip actually on the road, or for lack of a better way, how good the plowing is. These are important because it tells us what's actually happening on the road. If you watch weather.com, it's telling you what's happening at like 5,000 feet. This is telling us exactly what's happening on the road, and it's also telling us and showing us trends because it's constantly logging it. So our foreman can see if the pavement temperature is starting to climb, if it's starting to fall, and be able to adjust what they're doing according to what they see is going on actually on the roads that they're responsible for. Next. So Pierce hit on this very briefly, but we also use the AVL automatic vehicle locating GPS systems. And this does a couple of things. You know, what it does is it shows you real time what your trucks are doing. I can click on, like right now, I'd be able to click on and look at, and we don't have this on all of our trucks, but on the trucks that we do, be able to see where they are, what their application rate is, whether their plow is up, whether their plow is down. And then also at the end of a storm, it can look at cumulative. It can show me how much we've applied within a specific watershed. Some of the important things for this is, one, is there is over-application due to policy or practice. You know, in New Hampshire, we say you're going to go out and you're going to put 250 pounds per lane mile out, you know, at a certain interval. Well, in reality, when those trucks go out there, some of them cross. You know, for instance, if I have 10 trucks leaving one patrol shed and they are all on that same state road, they all drive down a certain section of that state road. Well, they all shouldn't be applying material. Only the truck that's responsible for that should be applying material on that one section of road. And then what happens is all the trucks then split off onto other roads. So this can actually track to make sure that folks are not applying where they need to. And then what I have is over-application due to perception, which is that individual that you may have, and often everybody has maybe one in their organization, it feels as though they know more and they're going to put more out because for whatever reason they don't want to have to come back in later, or you know, their neighbor's going to be driving down their road, so they want it to be really good. So those are the type of things that this AVL GPS would be able to look at. I will hit on one state quickly. Iowa has a system, and it's kind of funny because if they hit what's called the blast button, which is where a lot of salt comes out of the back of the spreader, on their AVL GPS screen that the supervisors look at, there's actually flames that come out of the back of the truck. So it's kind of a way of them saying this is really not what you're supposed to be doing. Next. As you can see, we've instituted a lot has accomplished. But I will say that without a doubt, the single greatest bang for your buck for any agency, if you really want to reduce chloride, is knowledge and training. In New Hampshire, we train all of our employees on a 3-year cycle. So if you work for the department for 30 years, you're going to get this training 10 times in your career. It's changed each time because new equipment and technology and things come into account. So we update all of that. No employee for the state will go out and do snow and ice removal without having been trained. So even new employees, we don't wait for the 3-year cycle. We will do individual trainings with new employees. We also make it's a voluntary program, but it's very well attended, in which we about half of our plow fleet are hired equipment operators, people that have private trucks that come and plow for us. And we will pay for those operators to come and they sit in the exact same training that our employees are in. And we train those individuals just so that they have the same knowledge and the same information that our employees have. Part of this training, obviously, is things like calibration, the snow and ice policy, really anything that has to do good storage, how you load up, good housekeeping in terms of cleaning up if you spill salt, all of those different aspects to the snow and ice world. Next. So I talked a little bit about removal of shade and trees. So this is a picture of I-93 down in the southern part of the state. We're widening it now currently from 2 lanes in each direction to 3 lanes in each direction, hoping to get to 4 lanes in each direction. But this is a section of roadway as it looks pretty much, nowadays. And then this next slide, next please, is a little bit further down the road, and this is where the section's been widened and the trees have been cut down. What this is, and some folks, and this is not truly scenic New Hampshire, but in terms of the chloride aspect to it, this does a number of different things. Number one, it gets the sunlight onto the roadway. The other thing is when we talked about bounce and scatter earlier, the multiple lanes, even if there is a little bit of bounce and scatter from, say, the center lane, that just goes into the lane next to it. So it's not wasted salt. It just may not be exactly in the lane they wanted it. So there is some economy and some reduction that we foresee just for the fact that we're going to have more lanes out there. So therefore, even if there is a little bit of bounce and scatter that's still happening, it's not actually going out onto the shoulders. It's just going into another lane. And as long as we take that into account when we do our application rates, then that will be just that much less chlorides that we'll end up having to use. Next, please. Next. So Pierce had mentioned we do have a low salt and a no salt policy. It's not used greatly, but it's allowed on our lower volume roads. So we look at it, especially in areas where there's some wellheads. There's one town I can think of right off in New Hampshire where we did a low salt right in the wellhead area that they have. Part of it, though, and again, it kind of goes back to that safety aspect to it, is we want all of the folks that are part of the municipality to be aware and agree as to what we're doing, which includes the fire chief, the police department, ambulance services, and the schools. Because those are the folks that we're going to hear from. And if they're all in agreement and they meet the criteria, the department will designate it as a low salt or a no salt, and we will treat it accordingly. And again, as I go back to it, for the cost of 2 signs in this agreement, it goes back to the 3-legged stool in that we're able to reduce the cost of not having to apply it, but it does to some degree affect the safety, but it improves the environment. So it's trying to get all the legs of that stool to be fairly equal. Next.
Caleb, this is Deirdre. I think we're out of time. Is there maybe one more slide that you want to show, and then we can share the rest of your slides for the group later?
Yeah, if we can just do, I think probably the next. Yeah, can you just go to the next one? Next. So when I said that whether or not these things work, this slide here quickly is what our salt usage used to be. So it was we were able to come up with a very definite relationship between how bad the winter was and then salt. Now advance 2 slides. And this shows now that we've instituted all these things, what we've been able to accomplish. So we've been able to accomplish a 24% reduction in the amount of chlorides that we've used on the 93 corridor by implementing all of the practices that I just explained. So, yep, and I can end it there. That's fine.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, as I said before, we're holding all the questions till the end, and our next speaker up is Lee Curry from the state of Maryland. Lee? If you're on, we can't hear you. Let's just give him a minute here.
It appears he's been muted by the administrator.
Okay. All right. All right.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. All right.
Great. All right. I'm sorry about that. So you're good?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Sorry about that delay. Our apologies. We had some technical difficulties. We had it all worked out earlier. So yeah, I'm going to divide this into 3 different parts. One, I want to talk about some connections, and it's, in my mind, it's a connection between drinking water, our highway departments, and then also being a person that's deeply involved in the Clean Water Act. I feel like there's a strong connection there for some of the for some efforts and collaboration. 2, I want to talk about some of the impacts that we're seeing in Maryland to our drinking water supplies, and 3, round out with what we're doing. And I think Russ will really take it away with our Maryland State Highway Administration's efforts, and they've been great leaders in terms of reducing road salts. Next. As I said, I think there's really some common goals that we need to start with the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act working together. We're both really looking at surface water protection from the Clean Water Act, drinking water protection from the Safe Drinking Water Act. Those 2 blend together with source water protection. We have state surface water quality standards for chlorides, and we also have federal standards for chlorides. We have draft actually standards in Maryland. I think also we can look towards the Clean Water Act, and I am going to expand it in this talk just briefly, with some of the NPDES, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, stormwater permitting requirements, and in some cases use these TMDLs or pollution diets to continue to drive reductions. But I don't think it needs to be a choice between having clean water or safe roads. That, to me, if we expand our partnerships, include highway and road maintenance, I've been talking about and keep hearing the win-win-win argument. It's the fact that we can have healthy streams, healthy reservoirs, our drinking water sources. We can also, by reducing road salts, have less costly drinking water treatment. Also, those road salts have, and when they get into the drinking water systems, they have impacts, economic impacts, and also aesthetic impacts that occur to our infrastructure. And really, in talking with our state highway department, they've experienced, I think, some significant cost savings in terms of ways to reduce salt, but also keep our roads safe. So next. Brief overview of the water quality standards. Pay particular attention to that chronic level of 230, and then also look at the US CPA secondary standards for drinking water, which in Maryland we have enforced at times, and those are very similar to the chronic level. So we're both trying to protect these water sources using very similar standards. Next. Next. So let's talk about some of the impacts in Maryland. And you can see from this figure, the red shows our impervious areas, and you can see those highways branching out, extending north and south in Maryland. And you can also see there's 2 large, highly populated metropolitan areas. Baltimore City, that northern piece, and then you go down and you see a little rectangle cut out. That's the Washington, D.C. area. And in Maryland, much different than I heard in New Hampshire, 70% of our community water systems are actually served by surface water. We have several reservoirs that are located around the Baltimore region, 3 in particular. We have both reservoirs around DC, and then also there's a Potomac River that divides Maryland and Virginia, where there's a significant amount of drinking water that comes from, that we pull our water from. So I think it's important to recognize some of the differences when we look across the state on where we receive our water. Next. Now keep in mind those urbanized areas that I was just showing you, that red area. The Department of the Environment has identified that there's certain areas of the state that actually it's not meeting its fishable, swimmable use. And actually this is really fishable, looking at aquatic life impacts. What excites me about this map is actually, I've seen State Highway, through the education that was talked about in the previous talk, show this map to folks and say, look, this is where we're seeing problems within the state. And Maryland having 19,000 miles of streams, we have a lot of streams, and it's important to recognize there are issues in these streams with salt impacting the fish. But then to continue the conversation and talk about the salt is also can impact the quality of our drinking water, and too much can cause some economic harm. Next. When we look and zero in around the Baltimore area, that northern area I was talking about, this is one of the 3 reservoirs. It's actually named Liberty Reservoir. And this is some information that I think it's important to see some of the trends, to show you some of the trends that we've observed. This dates back to about 1980, and the data extends to 2010. You see 6 monitoring stations of streams going into one of our drinking water reservoirs. And just note the trends in chlorides. You see it was relatively flat between 80 and 95, and then beginning to see quite a significant increase. If you look closely, I think you can start to see some changes between the 2000 and 2010 time period. But this is important because nonetheless, those trends are still increasing, and it's important for us to pay attention to them now and find smarter ways to, again, manage our roads and also and clean up our streams and drinking water. Next. If we zoom in a little bit, because notice those concentrations were around the 30 to 40 milligrams per liter range, that's lower than the standard, but keep in mind that that trend's increasing, and those were also samples taken during dry weather conditions. We have several watersheds, one around Washington, D.C. We were looking at 4 monitoring stations. And one I wanted to illustrate was on the bottom of this page. You can see through the winter time when we've had continuous samplers out there that chloride concentrations in the streams can get well above the criteria that we're trying to manage to. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. That's almost 3 times above those levels. So we're seeing these spikes, and I think some folks may think, well, Maryland doesn't get a lot of snow, but keep in mind we have a lot of freeze-thaw cycles. So as soon as we get snow, a few days later, the snow's gone, the roads have warmed up some, and the next time there's a snow that comes, we need to again treat those roads, make them safe. So it's not that, it's a very different scenario that I think Russ will probably talk more about a little bit later. Next. Also, it's not just the chlorides. When you think about public health impacts and people on sodium limited diets, the sodium is also increasing. And this is some information that dates back to the 90s, late 90s up till today, looking at the Washington, D.C. area, public water systems. And what it's showing you is that that red line is water pulled from one of our large rivers, the Potomac. And you can see some spikes through the winter time, but you can also see an increasing trend. So it's a combination from a public health perspective. We're looking at the chlorides that are in the systems, but also the impacts for sodium and those folks on sodium sensitive diets. So those are 2 of the issues that we're paying attention to. Next. And then the potential drinking water impacts. We've talked a little bit about corrosivity and the fact that it's by reducing the salt, you can minimize some of the impacts to our distribution systems, and thinking about corrosivity in pipes and what that means. You could, because of salts, there's an increased need for chloride and as a disinfectant. And then also, as I talked about, keeping those sodium levels low and the important health impacts to that. And I want to point out one other issue, and next, please. this is one of our counties around the Baltimore City region. It's actually Baltimore County. And what you can see are those red triangles. Those are, that's monitoring information or complaints from wells. And this is a complaint from each property owner. And they're talking about, taste, and they're also reporting complaints on their appliances. And again, another economic impact that we're seeing and hearing about is people's appliances in their house rusting out sooner, rusting out earlier. So again, how do we manage this? How do we prevent this? Next, please. So I wanted to go through those series of slides just to give you an impact of what we're seeing in Maryland, pointing out those trends that we're observing in the drinking water reservoirs, noting that there's impacts to infrastructure, there's impacts in terms of economics in replacing appliances earlier and having to fix infrastructure earlier. Then the question becomes from an environmental agency, what are the things that we're doing about it? And it's a little different from New Hampshire. I'm going to talk from some of our larger permitting applications and what we're seeing. Next. So Maryland's approach. In 2010, our General Assembly, through our legislature, actually recognized road salt as an issue. And they passed legislation for Maryland to develop actually a statewide salt management plan. State Highway took that to heart, did excellent work, coordinated with us on certain issues and impacts related to water quality. And actually, there's a revised plan that was just put out in October of 2017 by State Highway Administration. Again, monumental work. But also, within MDE, what we're looking at and what you heard earlier is education, education, and education. It's really, how do you train folks, whether it's in highway departments or whether it's within certain counties or what's happening in parking lots and with commercial application. So it's a tremendous amount of education. We also have these stormwater permits, which I'll talk to you about in just a little bit, where we brought in requirements to understand what's actually happening out on the watershed, and I'll share some of those results. And we're expanding those permits within Maryland to better address and go straight to implementation in terms of how do we continue to reduce and make progress in keeping the roads safe, but keeping the waters clean. And we're evaluating progress, and then also I'll close with looking at some other Clean Water Act tools we can use if necessary. Next. So you can go to the 411 on road salt. This is a MDE webpage. And I think it's important to point out the related links, not just the information on road salt, but the salt management plan that I talked about, Maryland State Highways, sensible salting. You can see there's a tremendous amount of information that we share. And every winter, we make an effort to go out and educate folks and make sure this is available to people in terms of the importance of managing road salt. Next. In Maryland, also, we have our stormwater permitting set up somewhat differently than maybe a few other states. We have very strong counties in terms of how they can manage their land use and making local decisions. And you see that shaded area within Maryland. That is actually the area that's covered by what we refer to as a MS4, Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permit. We have 10 counties that are covered by this permit, and one of the permit responsibilities and requirements is to, in fact, manage and continue to reduce road salts, de-icing materials. In addition, our State Highway Administration also has a permit, and all the roads in Maryland under this shaded area on the map that you see in front of you are also covered under that same permit. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in that permit. Next. So the current permit we have, it says reduce pollutants from management activities at county or, in this case, state highway, state-owned facilities. That includes roadways. And what we're doing right now is focusing on, one of the items we're focusing on is winter de-icing material, and that includes research, material testing, equipment calibration, looking at new, better equipment that can be used to more effectively and efficiently put down less salts, but again, still emphasizing the importance of safe travel and safe roads. Employee training is part of this, so not just for the state highway, but for all those 11 counties or 10 counties that I was talking about that cover that shaded area. We feel all that results in more effective decision making. Next. I want to zero in and go back to Baltimore County for just a minute and talk about some of their efforts. One thing they've done is they've started a snow school and they've offered this annually to county employees and also some of their contract employees, making sure that they're up to date on sensible, smart road salt applications. They're also looking at doing a better job of inspecting their roads, their equipment prior to snow seasons. And they're piloting some new technologies like the automated spinner that was talked about earlier. And then also reaching out and talking to their educational institutions. For example, one is a community college that is now tracking its treatment of its parking areas. So again, reaching out not just to the roadways, but to those community areas also. Next slide. And we're making progress. What this slide is showing you is over a 15-year period starting in the year 2000. The line at the top is the State Highway Administration. Again, monumental progress in terms of reducing the amount of salt applied to roads, but still keeping the roads safe and again, cleaning up the waters. The line below you see is what Baltimore County has been doing over the last 15 years also, saying that there is a downward trend. So in our mind, that's positive. We keep pushing that trend of road salt application down. From my perspective, working at Department of the Environment, that is so important for both, our drinking water supply and also protecting aquatic life in our streams. And also, it's a cost savings, I think, for our highway department and also our maintenance departments in the counties. Next. We're moving to a next generation permit, and what we're doing is emphasizing more requirements and learning from what we've done before, and making sure that we continue to advance the way we manage and apply our road salts. And we're going further to say, here's the things that shall happen, but equipment replacement schedule. If a jurisdiction has just purchased new equipment, we need to be sensible about when that would be replaced. But when it is replaced, making sure that they replace it with new, better, up-to-date equipment that can result in more efficient, effective applications in terms of treating the roads. The other piece is requiring an annual salt management training, much like I showed you in Baltimore County and much like State Highway has been doing. And also having the information of what's happening is incredible knowledge for us. So knowing what is going down in terms of road salts, reporting that back to us, and telling us about the equipment that is being used, that allows us to share it across road maintenance crews in counties, and allows us to share it with State Highway. And again, we're really looking to State Highway in terms of its communication across these important permits to share their experiences with how they've changed and made progress towards road salt applications through, again, smarter technologies, better management. Next. So what's next for the state in summary? So the MPDS permit from a high level, that's what I wanted to share with you today. We have a next generation permit that has, in my mind, much more stringent requirements, but smarter requirements. And I think it's things that make sense from not one or the other of safe roads versus clean water, but finding the smarter ways to achieve both. We're expanding State Highways efforts, which you'll hear about briefly, into the other 10, those large counties in that map that I showed you that covers most of the state, and it covers a large part of our population in Maryland. And we're going to continue to monitor those efforts and identify and expand upon what works. Again, we have to have the information to see what's happening in terms of trends. We can use other Clean Water Act tools, but our view right now is let's go straight to implementation instead of working on the path of a TMDL from the Clean Water Act point of view, that pollution diet that you hear about. We think this is a great opportunity to show how it can be a stronger partnership and better solutions. And I think the partnerships, just to conclude with, really it's the Clean Water Act program and the Safe Drinking Water Act program. Again, having those programs work together and continue to work together for that source water protection as well as the surface water quality improvements. Working with our MS4 stormwater jurisdictions, we feel that's a great opportunity here to expand this MS4 jurisdictions. And then also that helps expand highway departments, public works, commercial, private. I don't know if you guys are feedback that just started on my Are you getting feedback?
Yes, but I think we're clear now. Sorry about that.
Now, let me, probably my side, I'm getting it on my side. I just want, if you look at those last 5 bullets, I just want to emphasize the importance of partnerships. Again, across the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act programs, our MS4 permittees, which include state highway, recognizing what works and bringing that in and sharing that information. Also moving into commercial private. Wow, I'll stop there. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry about that, Lee.
No problem. That's a good place to stop. Next.
All right. Well, next up is Russ Urich, who's last but not least from the Maryland Department of Transportation. Russ, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me fine?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Russell Urich. I'm the director with the Office of Maintenance within the Maryland State Highway, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak today about the efforts within Maryland. Maryland State Highway, while we own and operate about 20% of all the roads in the state of Maryland, that 20% of the mileage carries about 80% of our traffic in the state. So mobility and safety are issues that need to be addressed, and but it also needs to get balanced with the impacts to the environment. Next, please. Just very quickly, just to give you an idea of some of the agenda items I want to go over. I want to especially talk about our outreach efforts and some of the technology. The stormwater management plan has already been addressed somewhat, but most importantly, the achievements that we've been able to accomplish. Next. So this slide gives you an idea of what's available for our winter resources. I want to point out that middle section where we're roughly, when we have a full call out, we're 1/3 of our snowplow force is state and 2/3 of it is contract. Our annual hired equipment contract requires that each of the truck drivers for the hired contractors attend a training related to plowing and salting of roadways. So I need to just back up to give you a little bit of a sense of where we came from. 25 years ago, we had a governor who had a do it now mentality, and he wanted our roads clear. He didn't care about the cost so much. And what it did was it created some internal mandates that were given down to the operations within the Maryland State Highway. As a shop manager, it was drilled into me that the administrator expected to see, he wanted to distinguish the white skip lines on our interstates at all times, regardless of how hard it was snowing. So they also, at the same time, were viewing our road network as the lifeline of the state economy. And they wanted to keep that lifeline open. They wanted to keep the economy pumping and strong, even in the middle of a snowstorm. So this mantra over 20 years, as you can imagine, created, we need more trucks, we need to use more salt, we got to get the roads clear. So that's kind of where we came from. We had a very, very strong safety and mobility goals, and we recognized that the environmental impacts also need to become part of that balancing act. Next. Goes, we also have a snow college that we require for every new employee. 8% of our current staff. So minimally, at least every 5 years, every employee that's involved in winter operations will get that refresher. And then more recently, we also started going around to each of the maintenance shops on an annual basis. So we feel that that annual discussion that we're having with each shop, where we're showing them how well they're doing with their salt usage, and being able to compare how they're doing with other shops that are similar to them across the state, has been extremely beneficial. We recognized that the first thing we needed to do was to change the cultural mindset and how we attack winter storms. and to talk equally about the environment when we also were talking about the safety and mobility. So the remaining shops are a good subset of what we have shared with the maintenance shops as we've gone around over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. And we've stressed things like federal highways, salt usage guidelines, what states across the country have done and where they may have had chloride TMDLs imposed and what they've done to try to meet those targets. We've shared the impacted watersheds within the state of Maryland and some of the impacts that it's having on the stream and the wildlife. Also, the impacts to the groundwater. Lee Curry showed some slides that we've actually have shared just to create that awareness with the frontline plow operator on what the impacts are to the environment. Next, please. So as far as pre-event operations planning, it all starts with planning. It's one of the very first actions that we took 5 or 6 years ago when we mandated that all interstates and primaries would be anti-ice before a snow event. And the use of brine, you wind up using much less salt that's being introduced into the environment, as Caleb had discussed. We also started conducting statewide conference calls prior to winter events to share perspectives and best practices. And hopefully those best practices will result in us also using less salt. When we create our emergency operation plan, we identify staffing levels and equipment resources so that they can provide just what they need for that incoming event. And a lot of that is based on storm intensity. So we also want to make sure that our contractual salt trucks are used more sparingly than they were previously in the past. Next. So when we get into a storm, we have our hired equipment. They're required to check in, and we have more emphasis being placed on assuring that there's no loss of salt at the tailgate or at the spreaders. We're making sure those trucks have been properly calibrated and that they're not on a full blast unload mode. The EOC, statewide EOC that I oversee, every 4 hours we push out updated weather forecast, making sure that operations has a good idea on things to be looking for and considering. We capture data through a statewide software program known as EORS. It's emergency operations reporting, and it's done by shop. It tracks road conditions and accumulation, but more importantly, each shop can use it post-storm, and they can go back and look the amount of salt used, how much accumulation they had. It calculates the usage rate, salt usage rates at each of our 28 shops, and it kind of sets the stage for where we need to go next. So next. From a resource management technology initiatives, I mean, these are a few of the initiatives that I want to talk about here over the next 5 or 6 slides. So next. I think everybody probably has seen a dilution of the solution chart somewhere. This is one of the slides that we've shared when we've gone around and we speak annually at each of the maintenance shops. We needed to change that mindset that more is better, because in this case, more isn't always better. And we want to stress the quantity in these terms, the percent of solution, that yes, if you're fighting a snowstorm and you're in the single-digit temperatures, you're going to need more salt. But if you're fighting a storm at 28 degrees, you need a relatively low salt percentage solution to be able to achieve the bare pavements. So less salt can go a long way. We also stress the role of salt. As Caleb alluded to, and you can imagine, 10, 15 years ago, we were putting enough salt down to burn the snow and the ice off the road. And we're making a lot of progress and good strides in getting folks to realize you only need enough salt to break that bond. And as Caleb said, you need to be able to work from the pavement up, from the bottom up, not the top down. One of the last things this chart has done for us, it's drastically increased the amount of brine that we're using now versus dry salt, and that's helping to reduce our overall salt usage rate. Next. So we're not only putting brine down before a storm, we also have probably about 10 different snow routes that are putting down direct liquid applications throughout the entire storm now. And I wanted to be able to give an idea of what that looked like, but if you can hit the next slide, I'll talk about a direct liquid application. So we're migrating to increase the number of routes using brine only. And there literally is no granular salt being put down on those routes. We can get a better control of the overall salt rates, which are considerably lower than most of our other routes. And for the folks here from DOTs or DPWs, if you think about it, typically we put the granular or the dry salt down, and we hope that we have enough traffic or the right conditions that that salt will be somehow created into a brine on the roadway. And that can take time. It might take a half hour, it might take an hour, it might take longer. And my challenge to you is, why not just cut to the chase and put the brine down directly on the pavement? And honestly, it does create an immediate impact and goes to work much quicker than the dry salt. So that's, this is an example of some of our brine storage tanks. While we recognize that the brine that we put down, we're only putting down about 160 pounds per lane mile when with our typical application rate, we have restrictions from a simple sense of we don't have the infrastructure in place to be able to use more brine. So I've got to build a plan and fund to be able to have more liquid capacity across the state of Maryland. And at the same time, I've got to retrofit our fleet to be able to put the brine down instead of granular. One of the other concerns we have is having water supply issues. Next, please. This is a shot of one of our more recent brine makers. It's the newest one we have. It's fully automated. It's increased our production. It can make up to 6,000 gallons per hour. And it also has blending capabilities for the colder regions of our state up in the mountains. Next. Much like New Hampshire, we also have AVL and MDSS capabilities. We recently got AVL in 100% of our state dump truck fleet. So they now can provide data, not only real time and knowing the location, but again, it can help with post-storm evaluations down to the truck and the route level. And it becomes the basis of watershed impacts, especially those that are considered sensitive. We're working to better harness that real-time data into the MDSS system, which is intuitive software that looks at the pavement forecast and gives us a sense of how much salt do we need to put down and when based on the forecast that we're faced with. Next, please. One of the other technologies we've implemented is loader scales. We can track down to the truck level the amount of salt that we're putting on each of the dump trucks, whether it's state or hired. We currently have 12 of these, and we have roughly 114 loaders across the state. So it's a little bit more maybe than 10% of our loader fleet, but it's helping us to also manage our overall salt inventory statewide, and this should be very complementary to our AVL data. Next. Caleb alluded to the type of plow blades. We're slowly converting to rubber blades that have a ceramic insert. We have many roads that have some level of rutting across them. So if you have a straight edge steel plow, you're not cleaning out in the ruts. We're finding that these rubber blades with the ceramic inserts have more flexibility, kind of like Caleb alluded to. And the more snow and ice that we can clean off the road, that leaves less residual behind that we need to treat. Next, please. Lee talked about the salt management plan. We were legislated in 2011. We're required to update it annually by October 1st of each year. And I think he gave you a good idea of what it was about, so I'm not going to get into that any more than we've already spoken. Next. So what's it all mean? Our performance measures the pounds of salt per lane mile per inch of snow. While I sit here, I'm embarrassed to discuss our rates from years ago. I'm very happy to share the fact that we've had a 58% reduction just over the last 4 years, which has equated in about $11 million in savings in salt purchases. So we're getting much closer to the federal highway recommended rate. We're trying to get our numbers down under 300 overall. We currently are at the 420 mark. And like I said, we're hoping to continue this downward trend. I know that when we put brine down, it's going down at 160 pounds per lane. If we can turn around and increase the amount of brine we're putting down, it should significantly reduce our current number of 420 pounds. Next. So this is a little bit of a summary on what we've done to minimize our impacts. Just establish a clear understanding of what our level of service measurement is and what it means. More importantly, we have to temper the expectation of customers. That's required not just educating our folks to do the work, but we need to educate the public and we need to educate elected officials on what we do and why. We're expanding the success on our DLAs as funding is available. Accurately measure use and keep good storage of our salt resources. We have 100% of our salt piles are under roof, much like the salt barn that Caleb shared up in New Hampshire. Pay attention to the forecast not only before the storm, but throughout the entire storm, and make sure that we pick the right application rate as storm intensity changes or as we're getting ready to exit the storm. We make sure all equipment, both state and contract, is fully calibrated. And the most important thing we can't stress enough to all our snowplow operators, both state and hired, you must apply common sense to what's going on in your specific neighborhood related to that event that you're fighting. Next. I thank you for your attention, and I assume they may want to open it up to questions now that we're at the end.
Thank you very much, Russ. And yeah, we are a little bit over time, but I'll just share that we do have contact information for the ASDWA and AASHTO staff, and we will have a webinar recording of this available on ASDWA's website. So with that, I think we have time for maybe a couple questions before we end, since I see there's people still on the webinar, and I'll turn it over to Brian Hong of AASHTO. Brian, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we have a few questions on here. I think the first is from Kara for Pierce. How did you calculate the road salt source attribution in the pie chart earlier in your presentation?
That's a good question, and sorry to say, I borrowed that chart from a hydrologist in my group. My sense would be that data probably came from one of the I-93 reports, which I've read a while ago and should have cited. But I know in that quarter there have been studies on the source of salt based on land use, and that originated, I believe, out of our watershed bureau. But I can follow up with a citation. I just don't have that source with me at the moment. Sorry.
Okay. No, thanks for your answer. So this next question is from David Evans. I think it was during Caleb's presentation. He asks, are there any contract requirements for training by private parties who are working on big storms for New Hampshire DOT?
Yeah, I mean, again, we try and get our hired folks to come to the training that we have. None of our hired folks are really ever out there working truly on their own. They're always getting direction from our foremen and other crew members. So we have a lot of oversight on that. But one thing I just want to quickly hit on is on the private side, we have training. It's called the Green Snow Pro that actually limits the liability of parking lot operators if they use the right amount of salt, so they don't get sued because somebody decides they're going to slip in the parking lot. So that's an interesting program. If anyone's interested, they can contact me outside of this.
Great, thanks. So another question from Joe asks if either DOT have groundwater contamination at facilities that result from brine and or sand and salt storage.
This is Rush Urick with the state of Maryland. I'm not aware of any chloride contamination that we have directly at any of our facilities. We've been very proactive over the last 25 years, actually, where we've had 100% of our salt piles completely under storage, and we have very good stormwater management practices at each of those sites.
Yeah, in New Hampshire, unfortunately, yes, we have. Again, we've been using salt for a number of decades now without always the best management practices. So yeah, we found in some of the older facilities that we have that has become an issue, but for the most part, it's not an incredibly widespread issue.
All right, thanks. Another question we had was, and this kind of, I guess, goes for anybody, any of the presenters. Do you have any suggestions for other states or either DOTs or drinking water programs who might be interested in working together, but maybe aren't as far along as you all are?
This is Pierce. Yeah, I think we often are. Our group often looks around at other programs and states that are I wouldn't say cherry pick, but just find those things that seem to be working and that could work here in New Hampshire on a variety of issues. And salt, while a secondary contaminant is still something we've got our eyes on and would certainly want to share what we're doing and work with others to do the same thing. In terms of I don't know if it makes sense to work through ASDWA or through another national association or organization. Maybe Deirdre might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is Deirdre. I think, this webinar is the first step in sort of sharing some information about how you are coordinating. So, any questions that people have, I think maybe you could provide some insight to other states, if particularly if they have questions about some of the ins and outs of your memorandum of understanding and that sort of thing. So, I would encourage other states to reach out to you all who have been presenters on our webinar as examples to learn from. So, and the more we can share, the more we learn from each other.
This is Lee Curry. Just to add to that, I think it's really important to share success stories of, where you go and talk about what you need and why. And I'm talking about it from an environmental regulatory agency. And the example that we've had communicating and working with State Highway, and we see that work as expanding out across several of our larger and more populated counties. So what we try to do is, take any opportunity to connect, again, our surface water folks, drinking water folks, and with respect to chlorides, and also, our highway departments and municipalities.
Yeah, and from New Hampshire, I have the opportunity to actually sit on the Federal Highway Snow and Ice Cooperative Program, which deals with basically all the snow and ice states. As well as just recently been put on the Transportation Research Board for winter maintenance. And I can tell you that Whether you want to call it environmental stewardship or sustainability or whatever phrase you want to use, this is becoming very rapidly one of the top focuses of the winter maintenance profession, without a doubt, both in the private as well as the public sectors.
And there are also other national efforts. We have the MDSS, the Maintenance Decision Support Systems, where we have like 15 or 16 states in a pool fund study. You also have the Clear Roads, the Aurora. There's a multitude of other avenues for DOT folks to learn of best practices across all the states, in the country. So I think the DOTs are sharing a lot amongst themselves. How we breach and get a little bit more networking between a DOT and the drinking water folks. That probably needs a little bit more, but annually we have our the subcommittee of maintenance within AASHTO. We meet annually, and they're always looking for presentations. And this could be a very, very good topic, one summer.
Great, thanks. These are all really helpful suggestions. Deirdre, I just want to do a quick time check. We still have a few more questions, but wanted to know what your thoughts are on we should continue.
Yeah, maybe we can go ahead and end here and just note that if we didn't get to your question, we can follow up with you afterwards with some responses from the presenters and share those also with the webinar recording and the slide deck.
Okay, great. Well, I wanted to thank everybody for staying a little later than our scheduled time, but I think there is a lot of interest in this topic and in further collaboration. So thank you again to our presenters from New Hampshire and Maryland, and have a great rest of your day.